the Dan Corder Show. South Africa is a movie. Correct. So, in the mess of last week with the meeting between Trump and Ramaphosa, you may have completely missed the fact that South Africa finally got a budget. Third attempt. I thought we were going to get GTA 6 before we got a budget. It was getting crazy. And this budget was big. There were lots of important things happening in the budget. We didn't get a VAT increase, but there were dozens of big announcements, some about keeping things the same and some about changing them. And the budget ultimately matters way more than we give it credit for. Many of us find the budget pretty boring, but ultimately the budget is what directly affects our lives through governments, policies, and how they are funded. And so tonight, I thought I would call on one of my favorite people who we've had before on this show to speak from a position of expertise about it, from the Institute of Economic Justice. Please make some noise for the wonderful Siyanda Baduza. A lot of fans of yours in the crowd tonight. I think they're called Baduzans, your fans, right? Yeah. Are you unsure?
I'm unsure.
Didn't know you had Baduzans. Siyanda, thank you so much for joining us. So a lot happened in the budget. One of the biggest things about the budget was the fact that the finance minister basically said, okay, I'm not going to change that much. I'm going to keep things largely the same. I'm going to do huge infrastructural investment. We're going to not do VAT increases. And we're going to try and make billions of rands investments to increase the budgets in basic services, crucial services like healthcare, education, and the rest. What stood out to you?
So I think the most interesting thing this time around with the budget process for this year, of course, it's been so contentious because it's usually just been that Treasury, they formulate the budget, the minister presents it, and that's it. There's public consultation, but it never really changes anything. So this time it was very interesting to see things actually evolve over the process. And I think for this budget specifically, the most interesting thing to see is a comparison between the three budgets that we had. So the first one was never presented, but Treasury had already worked on it for weeks, probably months. So there was actually a document that was posted before the minister gave his speech in February, and we had access to that. And then there was the March budget, which of course was rejected for VAT purposes, and then this third budget, or budget 3.0 as we're calling it. But when you compare the three budgets, I think it tells a story. And I think I agree with you that there definitely are increases to infrastructure and a lot of social spending and investment, which is very different from what we had seen in previous years. But because what we've seen in previous years is what we'd term austerity. There's been a massive focus on keeping debt to GDP levels low. And so there've been many progressive cuts in a lot of spending. So I know for many people, it seems very abstract, but there's been very clear degradation of the quality of services that we receive. So quick example, 2024 was when we voted, right? That was my second time voting. The first time was 2019. Same voting station, incredibly different experiences. Second time around, first time around, I arrived late to my voting station, voted pretty quickly. Second time around, arrived early, stayed there much longer than I did at the first time. And that was the experience of many people. And the main reason for that was because the IEC had their funding slashed in between those years. And that had led to a very direct degradation of the service that they receive. Similar story told across the social services in South Africa. So this budget, or the first budget for this year, was all about reversing a lot of those cuts. Yeah. Not necessarily ending austerity, but in many ways, I think there was an acknowledgement that you can't keep slashing budgets forever. Eventually, people are going to suffer, people are going to die. So the first budget put a lot in terms of increases to social spending, to infrastructure. But of course, that was premised on a 2% VAT increase, which of course was unacceptable. They didn't even get to present it.
Got us an extra 60 to 75 billion rand in our budgets by some estimates.
Yes, exactly. And that would have just been for the year, I think, because I think the second time around when they dropped it to 0.5%, then that was projected to raise around 75 million over a 3-year period. So, and then this time around, of course, there is no VAT increase. But then the interesting thing, or the sad thing essentially, is that we've taken one step forward when it comes to reversing a lot of those cuts. But unfortunately, the rejection of VAT came with rolling back of a lot of those services. So for example, in my area, which is social grants, the first budget was proposing a 22 billion increase in social grants. they took away the 2% VAT increase. So the second time round, it was only like 9 billion.
Sure.
Third time round, no more VAT. There's only a 1.5 billion increase in social grants.
Yeah.
Yes, it's still positive, but of course, compared to those three budgets, you see the story, which is that a lot of the spending cuts that were reversed have now unfortunately been rolled back. And that's disappointing because VAT isn't the only way to raise revenue, which is what we were saying. I think your segment earlier I enjoyed on the inefficiencies in government spending. That's very low-hanging fruit to raise revenue.
Yeah.
Take away money from corruption, you're able to fund that into social expenditure.
And as SARS Commissioner Kisveta said, if you just empower SARS to be able to go after people who should be paying tax but are avoiding paying tax, you can get back as much money, if not more. But we know why. You know why SARS doesn't get empowered, right? Because then it would have enough resources to go after the big people. That's why SARS does. Shame. Okay. No, actually not a conspiracy theory. I stand by what I just said.
Yeah, the SARS story is exactly what I was talking about earlier, because they're part of these government-funded agencies. And that's exactly what they're saying, is that your spending cuts to us have reduced our ability to be able to collect taxes over the year, which means that there are people getting away with not paying their fair share, but SARS doesn't have the capacity, they don't have the people to employ to be able to find these loopholes and find the people who aren't paying their fair share. So all they were saying was increase our funding and then we'll be able to find you the taxes that you need. Of course, unfortunately, there aren't that big increases to SARS this time around, but they have been given a mandate to fund more revenue. And the government, it's essentially an ultimatum, find more money for us or we're going to implement tax cuts next year.
For sure. Now, a massive part of the finance minister's speech, which I feel like he left to the end because he didn't want anyone to talk about it. He was hoping nobody would notice. But there's a social relief of distress grant. Very quickly, if you don't know, a social relief of distress grant was initially the COVID grant of about 300 Rand. That's now been increased to about 400-ish Rand or a little bit more than that. That was supposed to help the most destitute people. And that, by the way, is like millions and millions. Some people say more than 10 million South Africans for whom 300 to 500 Rand a month would be a life-changing amount of money to help them get by and survive. Now, the Institute of Economic Justice, that Siyanda's a part of, successfully took the government treasury to court last year to force them to provide accessible and just availability to that grant for many people who couldn't access it even though they deserved to because of the ways that that grant was rolled out. So at the very end of the finance minister's speech for Budget 3.0, he said, by the way, in 2026, we're going to get rid of their social relief of distress grant and convert it to a job seekers allowance. So the idea behind that is you get an allowance to survive if you are actively seeking a job. But does that mean suddenly that people who rely on the SRD grant who are pensioners or older than working age or younger than working age get screwed? That's the question that he wanted us not to notice or talk about. But fortunately, I noticed and so did Siyanda. So he's going to talk about it right now.
Yeah, so the main idea there, which I think that the minister is capitalizing on and Treasury are capitalizing on, is this idea of, or I'd say stigma against grant recipients, because there's a lot of perceptions that once people receive grants, it makes them lazy, it makes them reliant on the state. So the assumption is when someone receives a grant that they would stop looking for work. And so that's the logic behind such a policy. It is that if you say to a grant recipient, instead of us just giving you the grant, we are going to require that you search for work in order to, and if you can prove that you're searching for work, then you're going to receive this grant. But it sounds intuitive, I think, especially if you've studied economics. It sounds pretty intuitive to
provide
say,
an incentive. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And if you have grants, then it provides an incentive for people to not engage in the labor market. But the evidence on the ground doesn't say that at all. So there's consensus essentially, especially among developing countries, that cash transfers, so social grants, or usually in the literature they're called cash transfers, they don't reduce labor supply, so they don't lead to people not searching for work. And in many cases, they actually increase the probability that people search for work. So for example, in South Africa, there was a study that came out of UCT and SALDRU, where researchers found that the receipt of the SRD grant increases the probability of job search by like 4 percentage points, which seems like it shouldn't make any sense, right? But then once I think you dig deeper, especially away from an economic perspective, into why that, so it's pretty easy to understand. So one, in the field of industrial psychology, they have this concept that they call an intrinsic motivation to work. So most of us work not just because we get money from work, but because there's an intrinsic value that we attach to work. So you work for identity's sake. I mean, a lot of us identify very closely with our jobs.
Just purpose, man.
Yeah, purpose,
exactly.
contribution to society, identity. Those are the reasons that people seek to work, and cash transfers don't alter that. And I think more importantly is that in South Africa, there are barriers to entry to job search and to the labor market, which is really sad. So this would be called a poverty trap, because we understand that the best way to be able to exit poverty is finding a job. But there are people who are too poor to be able to search for a job. Easy to understand again when you look at the cost of job search in South Africa. So there's an organization called Youth Capital, and every year they estimate the cost of job search in South Africa. The latest result says that it costs around 1,470 rands a month in order to search for work.
And that's transport, printing costs, internet usage, all of that kind of stuff.
Exactly. So there's all of those costs that are associated with searching for a job, like the ones you mentioned. And the result then, when you give people grants, is you give them income in order to be able to overcome those barriers, and people are then able to search for work. So the reason for this policy is really not there when you consider the real reasons why and the evidence.
As well as the fact that one of the biggest dangers to finding work is getting sick or not eating well, right? So it'd be super great if you had a grant that could cover those things. Well, we're out of time, but I think that you've now very clearly heard what the next great argument is going to be in South Africa's Treasury. Thank you so much, Siyanda Baduza from the IEJ. Wasn't he fantastic? So good.